Hello and welcome again to Simple Ways. Today we are going to continue our jump start of apps script regarding the web apps or the web deployment, whatever we are going to call it. And we are going today to see the versions, the head deployment, the version deployments, the archives, where is our archived code, how can I change a deployed version, and is the testing of the deployments, and a lot of important things that what we are going to see today. So we just start a new script. Simply I need my do get function to start deployment, and inside my do get function, simply as usual I need to return a web page. So I will be using the HTML. We have spoken about this in the previous video. You can see in the link on the top, HTML service dot create output from a file, and then I'll make my file as the index. We use index.html. Simply here, when I'm going to add an HTML file, Google, I'll call it index, so it can be referenced from my script. And simply Google gives you a piece HTML to start from. I'm going simply to add here a div. Okay, and I need to remember to close my div because here there's no auto closure. And inside my div, simply I will say that's my first deploy for today. Okay, so that's my first deploy or deployment, as we like to call it. And then I'm going to save. Okay, that's my code, no more than that. And now, to make testing, you need to make a first deploy before testing. So before testing, you need to make a first deploy. If you go even to test now, test deployments, and you selected web app and done. Okay, sorry, I didn't show you. Test deployments. Again, web app. Deploy the project as web app once. So you need to deploy once before you are able to test. So I'm going to make a new deployment. I'm going to select it as a web app for now, and then we'll discuss the other options we are having. So now this one is let's call it first. Okay, that's only for myself now. Deploy. Now my web app is deployed. I take a copy of my web app and then I put it in a new browser window or browser tab. Okay, that's my first deployment, and here execution. They executed, and this is the ID of this deployment. Okay, now we understood it. Okay, done. When I'm going to make some modifications to my web app, if I come here, for example, and I need to add inside the div some style. Okay, and in my style, for example, I will select font size 15 pixels. Okay, and I save, Control S. Now I don't need to deploy to see the effect that I make to the code, whether it is the app script code or the JavaScript code or to my HTML code. Simply here I can come to deploy and then test deployment. Now we can see directly that you have a URL for your test deployment. Each deployment, each version of the deployment is having a unique URL, but for the test deployment, it's having one URL which is never changing, because that's the URL of what we are going to say. That's the head deployment. The head deployment is the current version of your project. So copy, and then I'm going to paste it here. You can see that it ends in dev, and this part here, that's the ID of my project. Enter. So that's my first deployment. Now you can see that the font has changed. So now if I come back to my deployment and then done, and I'm going to change this also, I'm going to put here, for example, a paragraph. Okay. And inside my paragraph, I'm going to make some styling also, and I'm going to make color, for example, red. Okay, that is change it here, so I put that again, and this one is my second deployment. And then I save. Okay, now if I come here to my test, which is ending in dev, if I'm going to refresh it, you can see that now it's changed to red, and whatever other modifications, whether in the code or in the HTML, is going to change. But now I'm focusing on the deployment, so we are testing a basic stuff. Now if I refresh my first deployment, you can see that it will never change. This first deployment is an image of this instance where the code was like this one, the output was like this one. It will never change the first deployment. If I turn back to my project and then I make new deployment, and I will here call this the second deployment, and then I deploy. Okay, now we have a unique web app URL and deployment ID for this deployment. Copy, and then I come here and I paste it. It's also coming in execution at the end, and then I press enter. So that's my second deployment. Now my second deployment, which is equal to the head deployment because that's the current version, and this one is the last deployment, they are equal, but my first deployment is totally different and it's not existing. So if I come back to here, and you can find here from deploy, manage deployments. Now we have a first deployment and the second deployment. The first deployment, by simply, it's version 1 automatically, and the second deployment is version 2 and with the time stamp, and that's my description. If you change here, you can change between the versions and you can change the description and so on, but these ones are unique. Okay, so what if I need to delete one of my deployments? For example, I need to delete the first deployment. I don't need to be shared anymore or anybody else to use it anymore if I'm sharing with people and so on. With the new modification of the apps script, there is no delete. Even if you return to the legacy or the classic editor or the old editor, you can find delete, but even if it is deleted, if you return to the new editor, you will find it in the archived. Okay, so the first here, you click on this icon, which is archive deployment. So it will not be available anymore, then archive. Done. If you return back to manage deployment, you can see now that the active is the second and the archived is the first. So if I come here to the URL of the first deployment and then I refresh it, you can see that, sorry, unable to open the file at this time because it is archived. That's my testing version, which is ending in dev, and then refreshing it, it is the same. And my second version, if you refresh, it is the same. Now, if you come back to the apps script itself, and you need to change the code a little bit. For example, I need to change here the code. I put here in the code, for example, console.log, which is not coming in the HTML file, but just console.log. That's we call this third. So I make this my third step. Okay, and then I save it for now. And I come to my index file and I change, for example, the font size. I'll make it to 100, so there is a difference. Okay, and I put here this one, my third. Okay, and then I save. Now, when I return back to my tabs here, that's ending in dev. That's the test one, so I refresh it. That's my third deployment. If you come to the second, it's never changing, that the second deployment will remain as it is forever. Where is my code? Where is the previous versions of my code? Can I retrieve my previous versions of code? Unfortunately, you cannot retrieve your previous versions of your code from the new editor. You can only archive them or retrieve them from the classic editor, which is here. Simply, I'm going to duplicate this tab so you can see the difference. And on the duplicated tab, I'm going to use classic editor. Usually it opens a survey why you like to return to the classic editor. That's for Google Work. That's your classic editor. You can find here the code and the index file, which are exactly the ones we are currently using them, the last version. And you have here a menu, a classical menu. If you come to file and then see version history, you can see all the versions of we had modified for this file where we are standing, which is the code.js now. you can see that's the last code of the which is available. And if you come to the previous one, we return a little back, you can see this one which is not having the console.log. So you can simply copy this code and return it back, or we can restore this code if you like. You can restore it directly from here and restore it back. If you return to the very beginning of our project, you can see that the very beginning function, my function without the do-get and without anything, and you can restore. This is only for the code. No, it's also for the index.html. So we are now at the index.html file, and if you return back to file and see version history, that's our last version with the 100 pixels and the color red. If you return very back when we started the first time, that was the first one without the colors. Okay, that's my first deployment. So you can either restore it. If I click here, restore it, and this one is restored. So if you return back to file, see version history, you can see this one is the last one. The previous one was the one with the color and the paragraph tag. So you can restore this one. So whatever you restore and then you save, you will find this one is your last version even on the new editor. If you need to also, we didn't see this one. If you come here to deploy, manage deployment, we had this first one archived. If you can edit and deploy. Okay, now it is deployed again. Still, the page is not found with the same URL, but if you come back here and deploy, manage deployment, and then my first deployment, and then you copy this one and I put it on another, okay, on another tab. That's your first deployment. You can see there is in G6W. If I return to this one ending in NGS, so it's a different deployment with different ID, but it is still having the same code and the same characteristics of the first deployment which you archived at one point of time. So nobody can access it forever. This one is done. Anyone having this code is not available for him again. Okay, and it's only available with the new code, even the first archive. That's a very important concept. So you know, also now I can get my code from the classic editor. You can find your old codes, you can restore them. Now today we had a wealth of information about the deployment, the version, the difference between the head deployment, which is the test deployment and which is the last status, and the deployed versions, and how to archive a version. You cannot delete a version, you only archive a version, so it's not available online. Okay, now you had a wealth of information, you have a lot of tools. The other thing, you'll find a wealth of information in our trainings, on our video, on our YouTube channel. Join, subscribe, spread the information, join our trainings, and see you in coming videos with simple ways for AppScript